You're listening to Body Banter, a podcast where we have conversations about the human body in all its forms and from as many perspectives we can find.
We are your hosts, Shagonya Dele
and Claudia Krebs.
And we are professors of anatomy in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada.
Anatomy is for everybody and every body, and we're here to get the body banter going.
We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Body Banter. My name is Shagonya Dele, and I'm speaking from Kelowna, which is in the traditional unceded and ancestral territories of the Silk Okanagan Nations. And as usual, I have with me Claudia. Hello, Claudia.
Hey, Shagan, how are you? I'm joining you from the UBC Vancouver campus on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. So nice to be here today. And we have a fabulous guest. She's a friend and member, past president of the American Association for Anatomy, Valerie DeLeon. Welcome. Tell us more about yourself.
Why, hello, Claudia and Shagun. Thank you so much for having me here. So I am an associate professor of anthropology. I'm located at the University of Florida down in Gainesville, Florida, right in the center of Florida and about as far away from the beach as you can possibly get in the state of Florida.
I'm sorry to hear that. I feel like the beach is like the biggest feature for Florida.
It's one of our most positive features, yes.
There you go. Okay, so you are the past president of the American Association for Anatomy. And in that role and beyond that role, you have done a lot of work regarding the ethics in our association and in anatomy in general. In fact, you just published a huge set of guidelines. Tell us more about the work, how you got into it, your journey into this work, and what the main outcomes are.
Well, let me just, jump right to the end of the story, which is that just last month, we were able to publish the American Association for Anatomy recommendations for the ethical management of legacy anatomical collections. My journey of how we got to that point is a long and convoluted one, but I'm super excited to just kind of tell you a little bit about that during our conversation today. I think the most important thing that I want people to be aware of, and the reason why I'm just so glad that you invited me to speak with you today, is that for the members of the American Association for Anatomy, and so many of our colleagues in medical schools, dental schools, allied health, anthropology departments like mine, we work with legacy skeletal collections of skeletal material that we use to teach our students and learn about human anatomy, human biological variation. And we as educators and researchers, we've all been relying on these collections for, hundreds of years, really. And it's in just the past few years, I would say really since the spring of 2020, that suddenly there's been a seismic shift in the way that we think about how we're using these tissues that belong to living individuals at one point and have become, objects in our teaching, in our pedagogy, and in our research. And it is important for us, for the association, and my position as president of the association and now the past president, I want to support our members in making good choices about how they use the skeletal remains and other tissues in their care. And I want to make those choices available in our rationale for why, there are good outcomes and poor outcomes. We want to make that support available to the broader community, not even just colleagues in education, but, just people in the community who maybe had a parent who was a doctor or an uncle who was a dentist. And, they wind up as the custodians for some of these human skeletal remains, and they kind of don't know what to do with them.
Right.
Or, what are the good choices to make about those?
Yeah. And thanks, Valerie. That seems to be super important. And with your reference to the summer of 2020, that just brings back lots of memories for me. And I'm wondering, just for those who may not understand or who may not be aware of that term, legacy anatomical collections, maybe you want to help us explain a little bit what that means and why it's important that we do this kind of work to recommend how people archive and treat and dispose of those materials.
I think that's a really important question to understand, like the terms that we're using as we make these recommendations and suggestions for people. We're using the term, and we have in the our recommendations, we've defined this term, legacy anatomical collections, specifically to refer to these historical collections of often human skeletal material, but sometimes also tissues or other types of like histological sections or, other types of blood samples and things. But legacy anatomical collections are referring to these collections that have been assembled historically from times during which our modern understanding of informed consent for body donation was not a thing. At the time a lot of these collections were assembled, there was actually no law on informed consent. And so these collections were established without any permission from the individual or their next of kin, and would just be treated as objects, as tissues, rather than the remains of individuals.
Thank you, Valerie. That's really interesting. And you said that in 2020, the conversation really started shifting. And I mean, 2020 was a huge shift for everyone in many domains of our life, including sort of the ethical discussions that were happening around the world, and specifically in anatomy as well. And yet, 1 year later in 2021, human remains from the MOVE bombing from 1985 were used in an online class, and that had huge repercussions. How did this incident inform your understanding and the conversation around your committee there?
The MOVE bombing victims that you're describing, this issue that kind of came out in the news in 2021, was just another example of the misuse of the physical remains of marginalized populations. So, going back to the summer of 2020 and the George Floyd murders, and then the Black Lives Matter movement, and there was this shift in our understanding or realization of how we treat marginalized populations, how systemic racism has become embedded in our educational practices. So the situation with the MOVE bombing victims is in the mid 1980s, there was a police action that resulted in the bombing in downtown Philadelphia, and a number of people were killed, including a couple of children. And the skeletal remains of those children, some of the skeletal remains of those children, were retained by the forensic anthropologists who were trying to establish the identity of those individuals. It is part of normal forensic anthropology practice to be able to use case material for teaching and education. Over time, however, these human tissues become kind of embedded in the teaching materials for people who are teaching about osteology, who are teaching about forensic anthropology. And people are using digital modes of teaching now. And so there were videos of the teaching of forensic anthropology that used the skeletal remains from these children. And it was in 2021, this incident you're referring to, Claudia, that it came out in the news that these videos had been used, and that the families of these children did not have notice and had not given permission for the remains to be used in that way. And so it was just another very high profile, really disturbing, but honestly, just another example of the way that human tissues become objectified in our education practices.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie, for your answer to that. And your answer really reminds me of a theme that we discussed earlier in this podcast about how the movement that happened or that started in 2020 and then later 2021 reminds us that the anatomical specimen, tissues, materials that we use belong to people, that they're not objects. They belong to living people with who had their history and their stories and their lives and relatives and people who loved them. And this is something I like to remind students all about all the time. But I just wanted you to comment on that, how sometimes we can become inured to that fact that these specimen are not just specimen. They belong to people, and how your work on the committee has also sought to bring that to the fore.
I think it's really important for people to understand that it's natural for us to, objectify things that we become habituated to, and that it can be challenging, but it's important for us to work to remind ourselves that the human tissues that we are privileged to work with do represent the physical remains of somebody who was at one point living and breathing. There are, even among the people on the task force for legacy anatomical collections that I have had the privilege of working with for the past couple of years, even within our task force, we debate among ourselves whether we are protecting or supporting the rights of the decedent as an individual with rights in the remains of their own body, or if a decedent has no individual rights, but what we're actually doing is protecting the rights of the living by caring for the remains of deceased people. So for your listeners, whether you think that the skeletal remains that you may have studied at some point, whether you think that that individual actually has rights, even though maybe they've been dead for 10, 20, even 50 years, whether you hold that view that they have individual rights, or whether you hold the view that that's just a skeleton, that individual is gone. But we do want to protect the rights of the people who are still living, the descendants of that person who would want to know that their loved one was treated with care and respect, of other people in society who want to know that when they die, somebody's going to treat their bodies with respect. So regardless of where you stand on this position of whether the decedent individual themselves has rights, regardless, the ethical treatment that we are promoting applies in either case. And so whether it's, the skeletal remains, are they a subject or an object? It's up for debate. But regardless, the eventual treatment of those remains is still the same.
Thank you for that. It brings to my mind this age-long discussion between mind and body,
Yeah.
and sort of what defines the personhood of an individual. Is it sort of their mind, their life, their aliveness, or is it the body? And I know philosophers have been thinking about this for thousands of years. I think ever since we started thinking about ourselves in that way. And as an anatomist, I always find it so fascinating to look at a human body and how much of that body informs who the individual is, and how much the choices and life pathway and journey of an individual informs their body. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that from your own experience of working with human remains, and where that has gone in your mind.
So it's interesting the way that you phrase that, because my personal perspective on using human tissues in my teaching and research. I was trained as a biological anthropologist. I have worked in the forensic anthropology space, although I am not a forensic anthropologist myself. And I have been for now decades an anatomist. And what I have done in my research and in some respects my teaching is to reconstruct the lives of individuals based on the skeletal remains that they leave behind. So I am looking at skeletal remains and estimating the bioprofile, making estimations, guesses, informed guesses about whether the person was a biological male or female. How old were they when they died? What was their stature? Was this reflective of their nutritional environment? What kinds of behaviors would they have engaged in that would have left skeletal markers like strength or asymmetry in the skeleton, different types of pathologies, evidence of previous trauma? All of these things, and aspects of personhood, aspects of a person's life, the behaviors that a person experienced or engaged in during their lifetime. So many of these things are reflected in the skeleton. So the skeleton absolutely is reflecting the individual's life. But my personal feeling is that decedent remains have become just objects. This is my personal opinion. I believe that those human remains need to be treated with the utmost care and dignity, but I am invested in protecting the rights of living individuals. At the same time, I have to recognize just how incredibly interlinked the body and the personhood and the life actually are.
That's absolutely, it's a great theme to think about and to reflect on. Because like you said, a person's habitus, a person's body shape, morphology, and so on, phenotype is intricately linked to just their journey and their story. So were they suffering from, say, scoliosis, or did they have diabetes, or or were they athletic, were they, and so on and so forth. And so what the body that we see at death tells a lot of stories, if we would take the time to think about it and reflect on it. But I just wanted to perhaps ask you just how has it been for you working on these recommendations and working, because you did mentioned it in a few minutes ago, how you felt incredibly privileged to be working with the people on the committee. But I just, how has that journey been for you? What was there any aha moment? Was there anything like that kind of comes to the top of mind for you about working on that, on the task force?
The thing I think that has struck me the most about working with the other people on the task force for legacy anatomical collections for the American Association for Anatomy is the passion and dedication of these people. So I was lucky enough in 2021 to get to assemble this task force of individuals. Can I go ahead and describe the task force? This is the most amazing group of people. So the American Association for Anatomy has a group of individuals who we have named our bioethics unicorns. And these are Sabina Hildebrand and Thomas Champney and John Cornwall. And they, along with Claudia and many others, have just been leaders in getting an American Association for Anatomy to think about the ethical issues of all of the education and research activities that we do. So the three bioethics unicorns joined me. In addition, we brought in Jay Mussel from LSU, who has experience thinking about the ethical use of fetal remains and the special issues that are involved with looking at the remains of these tissues from the prenatal period, we brought in Dominic Hall, who represents museum professionals and curators. And so coming in with that perspective of, how do we deal with the curation, archiving, and establishing provenance for these skeletal collections, or that I should say anatomical collections. We brought in Carlina Delacova, who's a biological anthropologist and well respected for her work looking at marginalized populations in these like large museum skeletal collections. And then Andreas Finkelmann from Germany, who represents the International Federation of Associations for Anatomy, and their ethics committee, and kind of added to the international perspective on these conversations. So, Shagun, you asked me, like, what was it about my experience in getting to work with these people? We worked together. I guess it has been now 3 years that we've been working together. We initially established a policy for the American Association for Anatomy for expectations of how we should deal with legacy anatomical collections. And this just laid out the issue and set forth some basic expectations that, you should do an inventory. You are responsible for proactively knowing what material is in your care. If you're the custodian, you've got that responsibility to know what you have and document it. Two, to making sure if you have it, that you use it ethically, or if you can't use it ethically, you store it ethically. And if you can't use or store these tissues in an ethical fashion, then maybe you should consider disposition. And so the third expectation is that, if you are going to dispose of the remains, how can you do that in an ethical way? Because maybe, incineration as medical waste is not the most respectful way to get rid of an inconvenient legacy anatomical collection. So the American Association for Anatomy adopted this policy, and it's like a page and a half, and it sets out these expectations. But, for a custodian, I don't know if you guys are custodians. I'm the custodian for a number of different collections. How do you actually accomplish these things? It's hard. How do you decide what would be ethical use? If you're going to store something, what are ethical ways to do that? What are the expectations for an inventory? Like, people need details to make good choices, or they won't make any choices at all, and these collections will continue to linger in closets and storage facilities. So the task force worked with me, and we crafted this ridiculously long set of recommendations, specific guidelines for people to be able to refer to. And then what was great about it is that, we had assembled this team of experts on this topic from diverse perspectives. But then we also took the draft recommendations and we posted them to the membership of the American Association for Anatomy, and we opened it for comment. And we got feedback from dozens of our members with suggestions for, improving the recommendations, for addressing certain situations that we hadn't thought about, for making sure that we captured an even more diverse set of perspectives in these recommendations. So I think at the end of the day, what did I learn most? I learned that the anatomy community is passionate and committed to making ethical choices about the human tissues in their care. And, we've got a really hard job ahead of us to make these choices and change our behaviors. But I'm just so confident that our community, the individuals in our community, want to do the right thing. So I come away from this experience incredibly optimistic.
That's so beautiful. And the recommendations are, of course, published in the Anatomical Record in the March edition, and we'll post a link in the comments section of this podcast. What an incredible journey to go on with all of these wonderful people, and what an accomplishment to come up with really thoughtful guidelines that are applicable that aren't theoretical, that can just be used by anyone who finds themselves in that situation of being the custodian of these remains. I want to go back to that question of sort of the ethics of using human remains. And not just legacy remains, right? So there's a lot going on in that ethics field right now when we look at digital reproductions, proliferation, 3D printing, a lot of the use of AI. A lot of people have published about this, we don't need to reiterate all of this beautiful work. I just want to hear your take on this because you're really immersed in this topic and informed through your work on this task force. What's your hot take?
My hot take relates to the digital footprint of our use of these human tissues. And I'll tell you a story, if it's okay, about the COVID year. And I teach a fragmentary human osteology class that's intended for, biological anthropologists, bioarchaeologists, and forensic anthropologists. So I teach a forensic osteology class, a fragmentary osteology class. And during COVID, during lockdowns, I suddenly had to be able to teach my students how to identify small fragments of bone. So, with the help of the amazing Rose Bryson, a graduate student with me, she's completing her dissertation now. So, she'll be Dr. Bryson very soon. The two of us built a massive virtual osteology database with beautiful interactive 3D models of all kinds of fragments of all human bone, whole elements, fragmentary elements. The problem is that, and this was based primarily on our teaching collection. And I was so excited to build this database and share it with the world until in that summer recognized that, I don't have the consent for these individuals or their descendants to use their tissues in this way. And therefore, this osteology database that could have been a really valuable education and research teaching tool became not useful in that context of being able to share it broadly. We do use it within my class where I can have conversations with my osteology students about how the skeletal collection came to exist, the way we should think about those skeletal remains, the fact that they should never copy and print images of those skeletal remains in their notes. It becomes a teaching tool, but it is restricted to us, me, my students, because of the lack of consent for the use of that material. And so, Claudia, you asked me, what's my hot take? My hot take is that the use of unconsented remains results in excellent teaching collections that are siloed to people that are internal in the club, in the know, that can be in a protected secret space. And that is not that's not an appropriate way for us. That's not the best way, I should say. It's not the best way for us to create teaching resources. What we're actively trying to do now is to build a collection of consented donors where we can make very high resolution CT images of their skeletal remains and recreate this virtual osteology database from people who specifically wanted their bodies to be used in this way. And then we can make those teaching materials available to a very broad audience, a worldwide audience, and reach students in places that don't have access to the types of materials that I'm privileged to have access to. And so I think our digital technologies are, they allow this open access and allow the world and you know, people, they allow increased access to these fabulous teaching materials. But at the same time, it creates additional new ethical dilemmas for how these materials should be used. My hot take is that that is a really challenging situation. And we can see the direction we want to go in. Claudia, I know that you are actively involved in creating virtual resources, not just for people at UBC, but potentially the broader community. And I'm curious to ask you, like, do you have materials that are restricted to only students at UBC because of, issues of consent, or are you able to make your materials available to the entire world?
So the materials that I have available right now, they were made open to the world during the pandemic to ensure sort of the continuity of education worldwide, and they were
Yeah.
used worldwide. And they're now going to go behind a login um, firewalled place. It will still be open, but people will need to register so that we know who is using it. That's a work in progress. Until that work is completed, they'll still be available, but then we'll move them gradually as we develop this. We do have permission because people signed the consent that their remains can be used for educational purposes. Has been seen as an appropriate use of the remains in this medium.
Right. I think that that's so valuable to have a collection that has been built based on the tissues of people who are consented donors. Like, that's where I think we all acknowledge that we want to move toward. And the question is, how do we build the infrastructure and get the resources that will allow us to do this? Somebody has to pay for this. Where does that come from? How do we support each other in generating, um, just broad community support to get those resources from our, individual institutions and administrations?
Yeah. Um, Maybe I'll come in at this point to say those are excellent questions, Valerie, and I think it's actually good for our listeners to kind of take these questions let's take home questions to actually think about them. And perhaps my hot take, Valerie, about the work you are doing and with your PhD students and creating that digital image and then making sure that it's used within a context of teaching where people can have the opportunity to reflect on the donors and so on. For me, I think my hot take is that you are doing an excellent work. You are, doing very thoughtful work. That you are, using these specimens and these material ethically, at least trying your best to make sure that that is what is done. And so that for me, that's really encouraging. Together with what Claudia said about, I think we have a whole, and you said this earlier about the community of people who who have worked with you on that on the task force, and then more broadly our larger anatomy family. How everyone really is trying hard to make sure that the legacy connection with collection within their province or provenance are used ethically, responsibly, and just with a mind to the donors and not just without thought to how this came to be and what needs to be done to care for them. So I'm encouraged by this discussion, and I just wanted to thank you, Valerie, for your comments and your thoughtful answers to our questions. Which brings me to kind of this stage in our podcast where I ask you, Valerie, we've talked so much about bodies and body parts. What is your favorite body part? Do you have any?
Many favorite body parts because it's all super interesting and cool. It's like asking me which is my favorite child. I'm going to say the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is, I don't even have to think about it. Definitely 100%. The sphenoid is the most interesting part of the entire body, whether you're a human, a primate, or some other random, well, at least mammal. The sphenoid is the coolest thing ever because it looks like an owl and it is the center of the entire skull and the place where your brain rests. It's like the keystone. It's the keystone of the body.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. I think every anatomist is going to get like a little bit of an elevated pulse and go like, yes, the sphenoid. How did I not think of this before? It is the keystone of the body. We're going to keep that. It's how we're all going to introduce the sphenoid from now on. Thank you for that, Valerie. It's a
You're
huge
welcome.
contribution to everybody's classroom. Conversely, what body part are you not so fond of? What's your least favorite body part?
My first thought for least favorite was my feet, because I have found with age that my feet are the thing that hurts the most. But actually, and I'm going to stick with feet, and I'm thinking back to gross anatomy. And I liked teaching about feet because then I knew it. But when I first took gross anatomy, going through the layers of the plantar surface of the foot, I was not enjoying it. Like, I loved cranial nerves, the complexity of cranial nerves. There's all kinds of complex anatomy that I loved. But the poor plantar surface of the foot, I think it was because of where it falls within the normal dissection curriculum. It comes at a place where you're like done with limbs, everybody's just ready to be done, and it doesn't get the love it deserves. So I'm going to stick with the plantar surface of the foot.
I sympathize. And Shagan is also nodding. I think all feel this. I think everyone feels this. Thank you, Valerie.
Of course.
Thank you so much for a really interesting, in-depth conversation around a really difficult topic, right? Like, how do we interact with human remains? How do we deal with legacy collections? And how do we adopt a more ethical stance as we approach all of this? I think we're on a journey here, and your paper is a huge milestone that people will refer back to as we continue on this journey. And thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to get a chance to talk to you about this. It really is a journey. We're all in the process of making these decisions and making these choices. And I think it's really important that we support each other and that we have an opportunity to talk about it in a non-threatening, honest kind of conversation as often as possible. Our recommendations are intended to be a living document, and those guidelines will change as we continue to gather more feedback over the years. And I hope it'll just be a valuable resource for anybody who finds themselves as the custodian for legacy anatomical collections. So thank you both so much for inviting me to come and speak. It's always delightful to talk to both of you.
Thank you, Valerie. And we have come to the end of this episode of Body Banter. And on behalf of Valerie and Claudia, thank you for listening and see you next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Body Banter.
We are Claudia
and Shagun.
And we look forward to having you join us for more conversations about the human body next time.